Ada for not wanting to maintain a bond with my granddaughter after my daughter asked her uncle to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. A month before my daughter was set to walk down the aisle, before she would step into a new chapter of her life filled with love and commitment, I had to make a choice that shattered the fragile illusion of stability in our family. I filed for divorce. It wasn't a decision that came lightly, nor was it one that I had ever imagined making at this stage in my life. But the truth, the cold, unyielding truth, was that my wife had emotionally betrayed me, and no matter how much time had passed, I couldn't pretend to ignore the damage it had done. She had not physically cheated, or at least, that was what she assured me. But emotional betrayal is a slow poison, one that seeps into the cracks of a relationship, rotting away trust and intimacy, leaving behind a hollow, aching space where love used to reside. For months, I had been a silent observer in my own marriage, watching as my wife connected with someone else in a way that was once reserved only for me. I watched her smile at her phone with a light in her eyes that had long since dimmed when she looked at me. I heard the softness in her voice, the laughter, the excitement when she spoke to someone who wasn't her husband. And I knew, deep down, that she was gone in all the ways that mattered. I tried to push it aside, to rationalize it, to pretend that what I was witnessing wasn't the slow unraveling of a bond that had once felt unbreakable. But I couldn't unhear the late-night whispers, the careful secrecy, the lies hidden beneath casual excuses. I couldn't forget the weight of knowing that I had become an afterthought in my own marriage. And so, after months of carrying this burden, I chose to let go. The timing was, without a doubt, terrible. A month before my daughter's wedding, when the entire focus should have been on joy, on celebration, on the beautiful life she was about to embark upon, I dropped a bombshell that reshaped the family dynamics forever. But staying would have been a far greater betrayal to myself, to my own sense of dignity. I refused to live in a house where love had been replaced by obligation, where my presence was tolerated rather than cherished. I refused to wake up every morning next to a woman whose heart no longer belonged to me. When my wife and I broke the news to our daughter, it was one of the hardest conversations I had ever had. We sat her down, no sugarcoating, no softened versions of the truth. She was an adult now, and I believed she deserved honesty. I expected her to be upset, maybe even hurt, but what I hadn't expected was the depth of devastation in her reaction. She looked at us as though the foundation of her world had just crumbled beneath her feet. Her voice trembled as she demanded to know why now, why this close to her wedding? Couldn't I have waited just a little longer? Couldn't I have held it together for her sake, for the sake of her special day? I had no real answer that would satisfy her. The truth was simple. I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to pretend. I didn't want to walk around playing the role of a loving husband when the love had already been tainted. I wasn't going to plaster on a fake smile and hold hands with a woman who had spent months emotionally invested in someone else. I owed myself more than that. My wife sat beside me, silent but remorseful. My daughter, through her tears, insisted that her mother regretted everything. That she had been trying, desperately, to fix what was broken. That she was fighting for our marriage. But for me, the damage had already been done. I couldn't unsee what I had seen, couldn't unfeel the loss of trust. A marriage without trust is nothing but an empty promise, a contract binding two strangers together under the illusion of commitment. I had made my choice. My daughter tried to understand, but in her eyes, I could see the sadness, the disappointment, the quiet accusation. My divorce had become a wound in her perfect picture of family, a scar that would remain in the background of her happiest memories. And yet, I stood by my decision, because this wasn't about her wedding. This was about my life. And for once, I needed to put myself first. The devastation in my daughter's eyes was something I would never forget. It was raw, unfiltered pain, the kind that carves itself into the heart and stays there, resurfacing in quiet moments when you least expect it. She had always been strong, always been able to handle challenges with a resilience that made me proud, but this was different. This was not just about her mother and me. This was about the life she thought she knew, the stability she had relied on, fracturing before her eyes at the worst possible time. She pleaded with me, asking why. Why now? Why so close to her wedding, the happiest day of her life? She accused me not of divorcing her mother, because in some ways, she understood, but of my timing, of making a decision that could have waited just a little longer, just until she had the moment she had dreamed of, a moment unmarred by the weight of my choice. I could hear it in her voice, the quiet desperation of a daughter who needed her father to be the pillar of strength she had always known. But I had spent too long being strong for everyone else, too long ignoring my own pain, and I was tired. She said her mother regretted what had happened. That she was trying. That she wanted to fix things. And I believed it, in a way. Guilt has a way of making people desperate to repair what they have broken. But regret is not love. Regret is the realization of what has been lost, not the promise that things can be the same again. And even if my wife was fighting now, she had not fought then, when it mattered. She had allowed herself to drift into someone else's arms, not physically, but emotionally, and in a marriage that is just as devastating. I told my daughter as much, but it did little to ease her pain. She listened, but her face remained tight with frustration, with sadness, with something I could not quite name. She was quiet for a while after that, needing time to process. I did not push her. I had made my decision, and there was nothing more I could say to make it easier for her. The days passed, and though she moved beyond the initial shock, the anger remained. It simmered beneath the surface, manifesting in the sharp edge of her words, in the way she kept me at a slight distance. I understood. She was caught between two loyalties: her mother, who had broken our family, and me, who had refused to pretend for the sake of keeping it together. And in her mind, regardless of who was right or wrong, it was I who had disrupted the balance when she needed it most. Then came the moment that cut me deeper than I ever expected. She told me I would still be invited to her wedding, but I would not be the one to walk her down the aisle. She had asked her uncle instead. There was a long silence after she said it, the kind that stretches into something unbearable. I felt it like a blow to the chest, sudden and painful, stealing my breath. The one moment I had always pictured standing beside my daughter, guiding her forward into her new life, the moment where every father feels both pride and sorrow it had been taken from me. And in its place, she had chosen someone else. She must have seen the hurt on my face because her expression softened slightly. But her decision was firm. She said it wasn't meant to punish me. She wasn't trying to hurt me, but she needed things to feel right on her wedding day, and at that moment, I wasn't the person she wanted to lean on. I could have fought it. I could have argued, demanded, told her she was being unfair. But what good would that have done? This was her day, and I would not make it about my pain. So I swallowed the lump in my throat, forced a nod, and told her that I understood. Because in the end, what else could I say? The day of the wedding arrived, and I watched as she walked down the aisle with her uncle by her side. I watched as she smiled through her nerves, her eyes bright with love and excitement. I watched as she reached the man who would be her husband and stepped forward, ready to begin a new chapter. And I told myself that this was what mattered, that she was happy. That was what any father should want for his daughter, wasn't it? But it didn't stop the ache in my chest. The reception was a blur of laughter and music, of clinking glasses and congratulatory embraces. I stayed on the outskirts, present but not prominent. It wasn't my place to stand too close, not after everything. And yet, despite the distance between us, despite the invisible line that had been drawn that day, she still asked me for the father-daughter dance. For a moment, as I held her in my arms and swayed to the music, it felt like nothing had changed. Like she was still my little girl, the one who used to stand on my feet as I danced with her in the living room, giggling as she clung to my hands. But it was different now. The weight of everything unspoken pressed between us, turning what should have been a simple moment into something bittersweet. When the song ended, she looked up at me with something close to regret in her eyes. I squeezed her hand gently, offering a small smile, and then let go. And just like that, I took another step back. In the weeks following the wedding, the air between my daughter and me shifted into something unfamiliar, something colder, more distant. It wasn't intentional at first. At least, I told myself it wasn't. I wasn't trying to punish her, nor was I trying to hold on to resentment. But something inside me had hardened. The moment she had chosen someone else to walk her down the aisle, something in me had cracked, and I didn't have the strength or the will to try and mend it. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange thing about it. Anger would have been easier to deal with. Anger is fire, it burns and then fades. But this was something else. A dull, quiet indifference that settled in my chest like a stone. At first, she still reached out. The occasional call, the polite text messages, the obligatory updates about her new life as a wife. And I responded briefly, distantly, never quite allowing the conversation to go beyond the surface. The warmth that had once existed between us was gone, replaced with an unspoken understanding that things were different now. She noticed. Of course, she did. My daughter had always been perceptive, always able to read me in ways that few others could. And so, over time, she stopped reaching out as often. The texts became fewer, the calls less frequent. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation, just a slow fading, like ink bleeding into water until it disappears entirely. It wasn't an abrupt severing of ties, no screaming fights or accusations hurled across a room. There was no slammed door, no final message that sealed the end of our relationship. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It happened in the unspoken moments, in the words that were never said, in the silence that grew between us. At first, she would send messages, brief check-ins that carried the weight of something unspoken. Hey, Dad. Just wanted to see how you're doing. Hope you're having a good week. Thinking of you today. I would read them and hesitate, fingers hovering over the keyboard, wondering how to respond, if I should respond at all. Sometimes I did. A simple, I'm fine. Hope you're well, too. Other times, I didn't. And when I didn't, she wouldn't follow up. She was trying, in her way, but even she knew the truth. Something between us had broken. Then the calls started coming less often. They had once been a staple of our relationship, weekly check-ins, updates on her life, moments where I could still hear the little girl she had once been beneath the voice of the woman she had become. But now, weeks passed without a single call. And when she did call, it was strained, awkward, as if we were strangers trying to find common ground. Months turned into a year. Life moved forward. She was living hers, and I was living mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was choosing myself. I had spent so many years sacrificing for my family, holding things together, being the steady foundation everyone relied on. And where had it gotten me? A broken marriage, a wife who had sought comfort elsewhere, and a daughter who had turned away from me when I needed her most. So, no, I didn't regret the distance. I embraced it. I told myself it was for the best. I had spent too much of my life giving, and now, I was done. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I just didn't care anymore. Then, a year after the wedding, she called. I wasn't expecting it, and when I saw her name on the screen, I hesitated before answering. Her voice was softer than I remembered, laced with something I couldn't quite name at first. Guilt, maybe. Sadness. Hesitation. And then, without preamble, she said she was sorry. She apologized for not letting me walk her down the aisle. She said she had been hurt, confused, angry, but now, looking back, she wished she had done things differently. She told me she realized how much it must have hurt me, and she regretted it deeply. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had played that moment over in my head 100 times. I had imagined what I would say if she ever acknowledged what she had done, if she ever tried to make amends. I had told myself that it wouldn't matter, that I didn't need an apology, that I had already made peace with it. But hearing the words come from her mouth, hearing the quiet pain in her voice, something in me wavered. Just for a second. And then I swallowed it down. I told her it was okay. That she didn't need to apologize. That I understood why she had made the choice she did. But then, in the same breath, I told her that it didn't change anything. That I no longer saw a reason for us to have a bond. She was silent. I could hear her breathing on the other end, the way it caught slightly in her throat, the way she was holding back whatever she wanted to say next. Maybe she had expected that once she apologized, everything would fall back into place. Maybe she thought the words alone would be enough to fix what was broken. I understand, she finally whispered. And that was what made it hurt the most. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply accepted it. And in that moment, I saw it in my mind, her face, the sadness in her eyes, the weight of my words settling over her like a shadow. But I had made my decision. For so long, I had lived for other people. I had lived for my wife, for my daughter, for the image of a perfect family that no longer existed. And for once, I was choosing myself. Even if it hurt. Even if it left a hollow space where something warm had once been. Because I wasn't sure I had it in me to love her the way a father should anymore. The weeks passed, then months, and the silence between us deepened. I had thought that would be the end of it, that we had reached the point where there was nothing left to salvage. And in some ways, I had been right. We had said what needed to be said. We had drawn the lines. There was no longer any need for pretense. Then, a few months ago, she gave birth to her first child. A little girl. A new life brought into this world, a child with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet patience. A granddaughter. My granddaughter. But the word meant nothing to me. I was supposed to feel something, wasn't I? When I heard the news, when the message came through, when my daughter called, her voice trembling with exhaustion and joy, wasn't I supposed to feel something more than this quiet, indifferent void? But I didn't. She reached out again, more frequently now. The calls, the messages. She apologized again, cried, pleaded. She told me she wanted her daughter to have a grandfather. She told me how much she wanted to fix things, how she wanted to make things right. But I didn't care. I sat there, listening to her break down, listening to the pain in her voice. And all I could think was that it didn't matter. The apologies, the regret, the desperate need to fix what had already been shattered beyond repair. She wanted me to love her child, to be a part of something she now realized was slipping away. But I had nothing left to give. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. And this was the consequence of those choices. Okay, she said finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. She didn't call again for a long time. And I went on with my life. I didn't think about the baby, didn't think about my daughter, didn't let myself dwell on what I was supposed to feel. I had spent too many years drowning in expectation, suffocating under the weight of obligations that had only ever drained me. So I let go. And if she hated me for it, so be it. Or maybe, one day, she would understand. The silence that followed was heavy. When I finally looked up, I realized I had been staring at the floor the entire time, gripping my phone as if letting go would break something. And then she spoke, her voice small, fragile. She said she understood. And that was what made it hurt the most. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She simply accepted it. And in that moment, I saw it in my mind, her face, the sadness in her eyes, the weight of my words settling over her like a shadow. But I had made my decision. For so long, I had lived for other people. I had lived for my wife, for my daughter, for the image of a perfect family that no longer existed. And for once, I was choosing myself. Even if it hurt. Even if it left a hollow space where something warm had once been. Because I wasn't sure I had it in me to love her the way a father should anymore. A few months ago, my daughter gave birth to her first child. A little girl. A new life brought into this world, a child with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet patience. A granddaughter. My granddaughter. But the word meant nothing to me. It felt hollow, distant, like a title assigned to a stranger. Something I was expected to cherish, to hold onto as if it carried weight. But it didn't. I was supposed to feel something, wasn't I? When I heard the news, when the message came through, when my daughter called, her voice trembling with the exhaustion of labor and the joy of new life, wasn't I supposed to feel something more than this quiet, indifferent void? But I didn't. I remember when the message arrived. It was late in the evening, and I had been sitting in my armchair, half reading a book I didn't care about, the TV droning softly in the background. My phone vibrated once, then again, and I reached for it with the absent-mindedness of a man who no longer expected anything significant to come through. She's here. I'd love for you to meet her. That was it. No fanfare, no emotional outpouring. Just those words, sitting on my screen, waiting for a response. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, my mind an empty slate. What was I supposed to say? Congratulations? I'm happy for you? Would that be enough? Would it feel real? In the end, I didn't respond at all. The calls came next. At first, they were spaced apart. Days, then weeks. I ignored the first few, letting them go to voicemail, not even bothering to listen. When I finally answered one, it was because I had run out of excuses not to. Her voice was different. Softer, somehow. Weaker. She told me about the baby, about how small she was, about the way she curled her tiny fingers around hers and wouldn't let go. She talked about the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the overwhelming love. And then she told me she wanted me to meet her. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the way she braced for rejection. She knew me well enough by now to know what was coming, but still, she asked. Because she was my daughter, and because some small part of her still believed there was something left between us to salvage. I told her no. I told her I wasn't interested. She asked why, and I gave her the same answer I had given her a year ago, the same answer that had settled between us like an unmovable wall. There's no reason for us to have a bond anymore. She cried. She didn't sob, didn't wail, but I could hear the tears in the silence that followed, in the way her breath hitched, in the way she struggled to find the right words. She's your granddaughter, she whispered. But what did that mean? A word, a title, an obligation. A responsibility I had never asked for. Did she expect the weight of it to change something inside me? Did she think it would be enough to make me forget what she had done? What she had taken from me? I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just didn't care. At this stage in my life, I had nothing left to give. No energy for rebuilding bridges, no desire to open doors that had been closed. For years, I had given everything I had to a marriage that had crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal. I had swallowed my pain, my disappointment, my rage. I had sacrificed for my wife, for my daughter, for a family that had shattered when I wasn't looking. And when I had finally chosen to put myself first, when I had finally taken control of my own happiness, my daughter had made her choice, too. She had chosen to turn away. And now she wanted me back. Now she wanted me to pretend that none of it had happened. That we could start over. That I could be the grandfather she wanted me to be. But I had no interest in rewriting the past. I had lived with the consequences of my decisions. It was time she lived with hers. Okay, she said finally, and that was it. She didn't call again for a long time. And I went on with my life. I didn't think about the baby, didn't think about my daughter, didn't let myself dwell on what I was supposed to feel. I had spent too many years drowning in expectation, suffocating under the weight of obligations that had only ever drained me. So I let go. And if she hated me for it, so be it. Or maybe, one day, she would understand. I remember when I heard the news. My phone lit up with a message, short, simple, filled with quiet hope. She's here. I'd love for you to meet her. I stared at the words for a long time, feeling nothing. No rush of excitement, no pull in my chest. Just a blank, empty space where emotion should have been. And then the calls started. At first, they were light, cautious. She would ask how I was doing, how life had been. And then, inevitably, she would shift to the real reason she had reached out. She wanted me to meet her daughter. She wanted me to be a part of her life. She apologized again, her voice trembling, cracking beneath the weight of her guilt. She said she regretted everything, regretted not letting me walk her down the aisle, regretted pushing me away, regretted not fighting harder for our relationship. She cried. She begged. She told me how much she wanted her daughter to have a grandfather. She told me how much it would mean to her, how she wanted to make things right. But I felt nothing. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my daughter break down, listening to the pain in her voice. And all I could think was that it didn't matter. None of it did. The apologies, the regret, the desperate need to fix what had already been shattered beyond repair. She wanted me to love her child, to be a part of something she now realized was slipping away. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. Because I had nothing left to give. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. And this was the consequence of those choices. I knew what she wanted from me. She wanted me to say I forgave her. She wanted me to tell her that we could start over, that I would be the doting grandfather, the father who let go of the past and embraced the future. She wanted me to say that I still loved her, that despite everything, she was still my little girl. But that little girl was gone. I had spent so long trying to love people who had hurt me, trying to hold together something that had been rotting from the inside out. And I was done. Done forcing myself to care, done pretending that I wanted something I didn't. I had given my heart to a wife who had betrayed me, and when I finally took it back, I had found that there was barely anything left. And now, my daughter was asking for the scraps. Maybe in another life, I would have been different. Maybe I would have been the kind of man who could have set aside his pride, who could have forgiven and forgotten, who could have welcomed her back with open arms and let the past fade away like a bad dream. Maybe I would have looked at my granddaughter and felt something stir inside me, some primal instinct, some deep, unshakable bond that could override the emptiness. But that wasn't who I was anymore. So when my daughter called, crying, apologizing, pleading for me to be a part of her child's life, I told her the truth. I told her I didn't care. I told her I felt nothing. That I had moved on, and that I had no interest in opening wounds that had long since scarred over. There was silence on the other end. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, she whispered, "Okay." She didn't cry after that. She didn't plead. She didn't try to convince me otherwise. She simply accepted it, just as she had accepted my decision to walk away a year ago. And that was the last time we spoke. I don't know if she'll ever call again. Maybe she won't. Maybe this is where our story truly ends. Maybe one day, when her daughter is older, she'll tell her about the grandfather she once had, the man who chose silence over reconciliation, the man who let go and never looked back. And maybe she'll hate me for it. Or maybe she'll understand.